Rahaab Allana is a curator and publisher at the Alkazi Foundation for Arts and founder of Alternative South Asia Photography in Arts, a platform supporting lens-based practices in the region. His curatorial and editorial work span major international institutions, including Paris Photo, the Rubin Museum, and the National Gallery of Modern Art. And his recent publications, Unframed and Another Lens, reflect an ongoing engagement with image histories and contemporary visual culture. He is also a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society and a recipient of the Order of Arts and Letters from the government of France. His lecture considers how contemporary photographic histories unsettle idea of certainty, authorship, and the authority of the gaze, drawing from recontextualized archives. It reflects on the tensions between silence and visibility, erasure and in reinscription, and the shifting ethics of curating and sharing images in a moment marked by instability.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
So we've had quite a morning already. I would like to thank the first panel for an extraordinary session. It's really salutary to be part of a group of people so deeply committed to the veracity of images, to what they mean in our present, especially this perilous present that we are currently in, where inscriptions or encryptions seem to be embedded within narratives, within histories, within spaces. Before I begin, I would like to send a shout out to the organizers. It's been absolutely extraordinary. So thank you very much, Alakananda and the whole team. Of course, all the co-organizers and this institution, Archival PhotoSouthAsia. Everyone is well introduced to them and Archival Matters. And I think I say this because we too have been extensively supported by organizations. And with respect to PhotoSouthAsia specifically, and Vasant and Shea are very much here. I know Sanjeev is also very much here, and it's in the most collective and collegiate manner in which this support is given and entrusted. So thank you very much for that. Yes, please. Okay, so I sent in my PPT very late, and there was a reason for this. I wanted, in some way, to speak to the sessions that were prior, speak to sessions that had taken place before today, that is yesterday and now. And there are sort of tangential sort of arcs that you might find between what I'm about to show and what has already been said. I was put on trial by my sister, by the way, at one point of time. And this is in the Dhaka Arts Summit. It was a particular moment. I think she was very excited and pleased that she got me to stand in one place, stand still for a little while, and ask questions about one particular court case that took place in the early 20th century. Many of you might know it. It was called the Bhawal case. And Ranu is shaking her head. She knows this case well. Many of you do. It's one of the longest standing cases to prove the identity of an individual who disappears and then reappears many years later. And I enact the role here of Mr. Percy Brown from the Lahore College of Art, who was also very responsible for setting up the Indian Education Services. So I go between his actual testimony that took place in Calcutta, and then I sort of transition into myself and give a take on what Percy Brown had said. The case itself was extraordinary, and we have photographs of that case in the collection, wherein everyone is trying to, this includes a psychologist, an art historian, as well as a photographer. Now, the role of the photographer is played by this gentleman, some of you might know, Mr. Shahidul Alam. This is in 2018, and maybe some of you will recognize that this was also the time before he was incarcerated. But what was curious and what was encrypted, perhaps, was that the lawyer who was enacting the role of this performance ended up being his lawyer in real life. It was not a future that was intended. It was a future that was completely unintended, and it sort of spiraled. And I think a lot of this talk is about those spirals. It's about embodied natures of images, and I use a lot of what Agamben has talked about, the Italian philosopher, and that is who does and who doesn't get to speak. This is something we've heard earlier. But how do silences really enter the moment of creation? How do they enter the moment of production? And then how do they enter the moment of dissemination? At each moment, there is a silencing. And even though one should think about articulation, I often think about its distortion. And so that takes me to the next series and suite of images. This was an exhibition recently done. I have to thank Ruchira because she was really instrumental in making this project happen at the British Council in Delhi. But it was called Distortion. And I basically begin with this very question: what or who bends the arc of history, right? What accounts for a distortion? Where does distortion begin and truth end? Who wields the power to reshape the present, and who bears the weight of its consequences? Who tells us what weight images should carry? And I think I ask this question because I do not feel that there is a fixed ontology of the image at all. The image has no ontology. It is one of the most free-flowing phenomena and objects that we know of. It goes from an encryption in your mind to something that you see on a screen. And so, through signs and symbols, I was very keen on working with two particular artists in this expose. And this expose was talking about how images are constantly in transit. I was intrigued by this because, for me, the idea that religiosity is also infused with satire and a kind of intellectual liberatinism. It is a way in which we transgress what we find on the wall and then sort of imbue it what we see on different kinds of surfaces. And for me, why else would this artist, Nandan Ghia, make something of gods, of motifs, of truths, of tools? How would he create a totemic symbolism that questions the uncertain provenance, the uncertainty of what exists in collective naivety today? What is our majoritarian omniscience? What are we missing? Why else would Kali, in this case, wield a gun? Right? Why would there be inscriptions on this? And you can barely see them, but he gave two quiet inscriptions over there. One says, Viva la Revolution. The other one says, Insaf and Haq ke liye. The insaf and haq of what we need to fight for in order to reclaim our symbols. How do we reclaim those is something Nandan Ghia asks. Now, his training and his practice sits very close to what I've been looking at from the time I was at university. And it began really with an interest in ateliers of collective production, of the fact that there's a way in which we can bring together works of art that are not produced with sole authorship, but with manifest collective authorship. Now, you would have seen any number of images like these. Ragmala paintings. I really enjoy them because at one point of time, one could see how the Persian and Hindu artists both came together to create these absolute mesmeric images of monsoons of longing, of winters of yearning, of springs of celebration, of autumns of contemplation. They sit very, very close, and no one has written about these more evocatively than B.N. Goswami and Guler. A lot of these images, of course, are taken from Guler. But I wonder what would have happened if they were made into photographs. And I do have to ask, is anyone here below the age of 18? Okay, fair warning. So I was interested in this image because I thought that if you have a Ragmala painting, and if you have an inscription of love and fantasy, of intimate congress, if we brought it down to a photograph, and this is a 19th century photograph, and I can guarantee you've never seen a photograph like it, what would it look like today? they're certainly clocking time. They're clocking time, and it's a time for pleasure, it's a time for peace, it's a time for intimacy. Some consider the gentleman over there to be Ram Singh II on the top left corner, the first photographer king of India, with one of his concubines. I've never quite seen an image like it. But what Nandan was interested in, this is not an image he's necessarily seen, is the moment of decognition, right? What happens when extraterrestrial lives enter the space of love and affection? So he uses those same ateliers, those same individuals, of course, descendants of them in Madhya Pradesh, to create a love triangle between objects which are pixels, seen within Ragmala paintings that have been made right now. So these pixelated, disintegrating, cuboid structures with jagged edges represent a foundation stone of something that is due to come, right? Anti-spatial objects like clandestine magnets, they travel through time and they cross tradition in ways that we've never really imagined. Now, someone in the last session mentioned the idea of transmission and transgression. I really like the way in which a certain animism comes into play. Ways in which Ragmala paintings have been replaced by empty spaces, anti-spaces, spaces in which lovers become objects. And what I think is interesting is that eccentricity itself is a critical knowledge that is important to bear in time, a future knowledge about things that are going to come. And as I said, auratic beings become both inscriptions and encryptions. They are imprints of a survival that we don't know has existed till this point, but survival is about a certain kind of resistance as well. And so suddenly, someone mentioned the Varaha who manages to enrapture and encapture Bhudevi, right, is then brought down to photographs of Deen Dayal, Hormushji, Born and Shepherd, right? And for me, this is a very important part of what we become. Receivers of a certain kind of image, but also explorers of a certain shadow line that exists. I like what Borges has always said about how we must construct images. Just like you construct edifices, he says you do not make in stone, you make in sand. But you must always pretend as though the sand was stone. It's a very, very pertinent way of thinking about how we construct images, what survives and how. And so these animated beings come into play. And I often think about them because in a recent exhibition done at SOAS called Unlayering the Future Past, I looked at the work of Hema Shironi. Many of you might know this work or this artist. And Hema Shironi describes her work as particularly about existence, evoking inner certainties and uncertainties, and how that induces a sense of untethering and displacement that is freeing. How do you free yourself from an ontological situation in which, I say again, the image has no ontology that is recognizable and is fixed? So the accidental and the intentional will always sit together, right? The coincidental will always be liberated from form. And the random and the pervasive will always seem like there's purpose, but they will show that there is no purpose. And I think when I think about that, I also think about other traditional modes which have been turned on their heads. For me, the work of Hadi Ranawat sits really, really at the heart of what we are encountering right now. A Persian traditional carpet made of matchsticks. We showed some of his work during Serendipity over here. But at the center of it, or rather beside it, you see the footprint of a soldier, right? The debris of war, the debris of unconscionable violence is somewhat embedded as a symbol always in his work. The work we showed in Goa was, of course, this one. called Turning Point. Right? Are we thinking about how internal and external territorial aggression may obliterate and foreground regional specificities? Does it highlight any joint territorial mandate that we have? Or are we all being converted very distinctly into black mirrors? To imagine these aggressions and the destinies that might befall them, I often think about where the ethic lies. Right? What is the ethic in which you see these origami planes and the map of Afghanistan that you see before you obliterated? But precisely between that space of the map and the plane is what Homi Bhabha would call the in-between. That carries the burden of the meaning of culture. It is always the in-between that carries the meaning of culture. So between land and sky, the human imprint, and the frailty that is born beneath, what then becomes the purpose of an optical collage that we see resonating through the other works of another exhibit recently done called The Parting of Ways? Now, a lot of you may know the work of Sukanya Ghosh, and I think it's always interesting to think about how self-ethnography works. I was looking at Divya's work and thinking about cross-media self-ethnography, and how is it worked through the, yes, through the archive of ephemera, as well as the archive of family. What does it enable us to traverse, and how distinctly and how self-assuredly can we enter the micro-narrative of a family, right? Even if we are insiders. How do we become, and I remember this from one lecture that Shohini you gave, how do we become insiders to the other? I think it's such a pertinent way of thinking about the space that lies between those who take images and those who make them. And who is the subject and who is the object is always in constant play. But with Sukanya's work, she's also looking at a certain kind of mapping. The arrival of image making in India, in Calcutta, in the 19th century, is something that she imagines will become a home, but a home that is elsewhere. And so the poem of Auden is something that is referred to often. The poem called Look Stranger. What happens when you are standing at the precipice of a shore, looking out, right? The ocean as migration, something that, we've addressed already in this series of talks, is something I want to bear in mind as we move, because it always interrogates the symbolic and the valences of location, and location is a psychogeography. And this is what Sukanya's work for me really shouts out at. Between proverbs and aphorisms, poetry, pottery, shards, bones, jigsaws, emotions, mythomemes, to dismembered sculpture and fossils, to the DNA that she's trying to reconstitute of her grandmother, to the molecular scissors that we see in quarks, to the asteroids that fall on the Earth, to the planetary rings that we are surrounded by. It is that indomitable part, that indomitable, what was referred to as a fragment, that the fractured whole will tantalizingly endure, right? So the Encryption for me is a parallel cultural universe, one that played out also, and I bring this studied book in one sense, The Surface of Things, is something that those interested in image making must definitely look at. The Surface of Things that was authored by Preetha Myers, also an exhibit that we had, of course, almost 8 years before the book came out. They were not related to one another, but they were talking about these cultural universes that we are framing between India and the outside world. It looks specifically at the Swahili coast. It looks at social and personal lives of images that are erased and then reinscribed. But in that reinscription lies the very notion of how severance, imperfection, and the subconscious are always going to lead to the manifestation of inner truths. And so I was interested in this because montage and collage, even with this presentation for me, sit at the very heart of a decolonial strategy. They are about the montaging of experiences, and they are about eventually how you debook, right? Uberman said something quite interesting. How do you use the past soul of a book as a fragment and its repeated gestures and consider those in the real world? You have to do that through the idea of unbinding that book. And I think this idea of the real world is something that I wanted to bring up again in the ocean as an archive, having heard yesterday's talk. I don't know if any of you know the work of this particular gentleman, but on the evening of the 3rd of November in 1966, a cyclone hit the coast of Madras, causing a series of shipwrecks. We believe that the ship seen over here was the Stamatis, one of the vessels which was dragged near the Marina Beach. And for decades, the wreckage just lay there. And I find it interesting because what O.P. Sharma, who was one of the greatest image makers, I know that Pablo was perhaps a student of his when he was teaching in Delhi, in Triveni Kala Sangam, he montages an image to create a heightened tableau, the tableau of the night of the storm, which is this one. But it is actually a shipwreck, and what you don't see over here are a series of visitors walking towards the ship to see it. He's basically created what he calls a photogram, a photo montage, a print, and a collage of an experience. And he goes on to do this through his other image-making practices. I find these quite interesting because they always hawk back to the idea that the image is never one image that is seen, even when there are images that are sandwiched together. There's the creation of an atmosphere, the creation of a moment that lies at the center for his thinking about what he calls the C effect, the superimposition of narratives, right? Narratives that for the longest time were foregrounding, as you see in the Stars archive, masculinity, were then used by other authors, were then used by other thinkers to foreground what can be removed from the image and reinserted back into narrative and history, right? And so this very much transforms for him into abstracted, very, very monumental sense of where the detail lies within image-making practices. What is the relationship of the grand whole to the detail? And images of Ajanta Ellora that don't look like Ajanta and Ellora is something that he creates. Now, he's known very, very well, O.P. Sharma, and this is taking me to the next moment of encryption. He's known very, very well in India for also creating images of cinema. I find this one speaks to this moment very particularly, the image taken of Shalimar. Now, he also created a kind of litany of images around other Bollywood films, such as Do Boond Pani, which marks the water crisis in India, and other government welfare schemes that are put into place. He also takes images of Hermann Hesse's Siddharth, the eponymous novel from 1922, and also Chupa Rustam. But then we come to this one, Shalimar, and I think it's a curious image which is talking about the mediatization of our current moment, right? How everyone is being surveilled and how the panopticon is very much of our lives and is central, but is also being foregrounded in the 70s in a very, very distinct ways. So for me, this moment at which we're looking at Shalimar, we're looking at these moments in which the visible and invisible are brought to a satirical center. For me, it talks about one very specific kind of thing. We are at all times in the grip of not only art, but journalism. So in our ephemera of collections that we have at the foundation, I found this particular one extremely, extremely resonant of this moment. And it is curious, it says this is the first time Naseer plays a full-length role of a villain in a commercial Hindi film. His role as a press photographer will bring a new dimension to his already multicellular personality. It's a very particular image called Bezuban, from a film called Bezuban, in which, and if you see this, I think Shemaru has put the whole thing, well, I mean, I don't know if they've put it up, but certainly a version of this is up online. You can see the whole film. And Nasiruddin Shah is over here, seen as a photojournalist, And of course, the reason I'm showing this to you after O.P. Sharma is because the whole question of art and journalism is at a loggerheads in the 70s and 80s. But here we have Nasir, who's pleading, as it were, with someone who is a minister to say, well, either you succumb to my needs, or I will show images to the world like you've never seen. It's a particular kind of image. It's a little psychotic, where people constantly go in and out of um, amorous relationships. They kind of go in and out of being villains and being, good Samaritans. But I thought it's a curious way in which the image is being foregrounded in a mediatized way. And this is very much the time of a certain globalization of the photograph and an opening out then of a kind of neoliberal capitalism, right? A paradigm shift that really takes place and makes new cultural records possible. And of course, the next one is a little tongue in cheek, but this whole idea that you can take a photograph and not actually look into the camera is also a trope that I found exists quite distinctly from the 1970s. I mean, you don't really have to look at the camera, through the camera to look at your subjects. You don't really have to listen to people in order to cater to their demands, right? I mean, it's something that we're very, very well aware of. But nevertheless, what I found curious also is that this is the moment of the paparazzi. This is the moment in which really, as a triangulation, you are being flanked, Sanjay Dutt being flanked in the 1990s by 3 cameramen, 1, 2, and 3, in order to share the story with the world. So how much actually what lies behind this image? Is anything left to our imagination? Was my question. While I was sitting at one of the archives in Delhi at one time, the Swaraj archives, a box of photographs was given to me. I didn't know what it was, but I suddenly discovered what it was. And for me, it sort of lay claim to these images. Images which we will never see again come out. They were discards of the Indian Express, discards of the New Indian Express. The Women's Republican Party, I think that's Oval Maidan, where the High Court passes a judgment that more imagery of more national leaders can be shown apart from Gandhi and Shivaji. And so there's a breakout. In 97, minority communities who are attacked by the police in Bombay. And then, of course, we know in the 90s, very, very distinctly, the bomb attacks, the bomb threats, and the Ansari clan that is associated with it. But this moment of journalism is something that I was interested in. And what do you find in these unintended discoveries? This box of photos that was handed to me were a series of photographs I was not intending to find. I was looking for images of Jyoti Bhatt in the Swaraj archives, but this was shared with me. And according to me, these are some of the most intense images that one will find of the Mukti Juddho, the Bangladesh Liberation War. We haven't seen these in the public sphere. They've never been printed, again or subsequently. We know that this event was documented extensively. We've seen Kishore Parikh's book. We've seen Raghu Rai's images. We've seen the work of Harmeet Singh. We've seen the work of Rashid Talukdar. We've seen the work of Saida Khanum, of Ghulam Qasim Dadi. But who is exactly taking this image? Who are these images actually taken by? And so I slowly discovered that Popper Photo, which was set up by Paul Popper in 1934, is responsible for sending journalists across during 1971. Michael Laurent and Horst Fass are names that you might remember, right? In order to document this moment at which the Razakars are captured and the Bengali guerrilla liberation fighters sort of capture them. And then they present for the very first time, I feel, in a kind of modern history, the moment of an actual killing. I guess what this presentation is also about is about those histories that we're looking at from the 1970s and the 1980s are embedding in ourselves and in the history of the image that we are about to encounter, a sense in which propaganda is going to play a very distinct role. For me, propaganda has a modern history. It has a colonial history, yes, but it has a modern history which is playing out again and again, right? And these modern histories played out not only in the photograph, they very, very much played out in film. Coming across the images of socialist India, I had not seen these images before of Indira Gandhi actually being photoshopped from the 1970s into their, nationalist journal, right? She's the commander-in-chief at the time, but she is also being displayed as a charismatic, efficient, and benevolent female leader. And all of this, I find interesting contours to this and interesting counterbalances to this in the image world, in the film world, through the films of M.S. Satyu's Garam Hawa, through the films of Manikol's Duvidha. They sit alongside this. And I do think that mediatized world gets manifested again and again. The Godhra violence that was put across by Ravi Kashi in Everything Happens Twice. Kutubuddin Ansari, the tailor who was made to beg for his life. But also Santosh Kumar Das's Madhubani painting, where he, who should not be named since we have this going, stands above the corpse of Ram. One of the most pertinent and potent imagery surrounding our current political situation is through a Madhubani painting. But it's been deployed very distinctly as a response to what we see in the media. Maybe that is the fourth inscription and the estate that needs to be considered. And I was always looking at these images and thinking about Tapati Guha's book and Wazira Zamindar's book, right? What are art's secular credentials? How secular is art? Are they universal and transcendental? Or does location matter? And what does location do to our devotional worlds? What does location do to our entanglements with nations and nationalisms? Something that came to the mind. Now, the political iconography of radicalization, right, is threatening something quite pertinent through these images. It's threatening the idea that free thought is dangerous. And so what gets flagged for deletion is also something to think about. I know a lot of us think that most of the images that we're seeing deleted from our online spheres are done by AI. But till this date, it's interesting that it is a human being that is behind the deletion of pictorial data. And most of the international pictorial data that regimes want to see deleted is done by individuals sitting in either India or the Philippines. It's a very, very curious anomaly to have. The other interesting thing, while I see this image, is in 2019, YouTube brought out data. And they proclaimed that it was interesting for them that almost 500 hours of film is uploaded to the internet every minute. And so in a day, you have 720,000 hours of film that is updated online. This is in 2019. That means 80 years of your life is a daily experience of what is seen online and shared online. But I guess I want to go and I want to end with a few images now in which a different kind of nationalism and exile has been foregrounded. Some of you might have seen the exhibition we have ongoing at the CSMVS, the Prince of Wales Museum. And I thought this was interesting to put across because someone that does not apologize to regime, someone who does not apologize to the fact that resistance is part of, you know, part of the experience of a polity is this gentleman, Pandurang Sadashiv Kankoji, a fascinating character. Born in Maharashtra, one of the founders of the Gadar Party. Even more fascinating for me is, of course, his daughter, who lives in Freedom Fighters Complex in New Delhi. And though some of these images have been shared in Documenta, I thought it's interesting that someone like Pandurang, who's born over here, takes his chances and goes across to the Middle East, goes across and tries to set up something called the Berlin Committee, right? He forms it in Europe, but he tries to use sort of German influence to divert British attention so that he can attack, with the help of the Emir of Afghanistan, of course this never takes place, with the Emir of Afghanistan, the British forces in India. Now, the Persian Gulf, the area we know as Mesopotamia, the Suez Canal, is something that he encounters in close quarters. And he takes this phenomenal trip across from India via the Middle East to the United States, right, around the 1920s, just in the aftermath of the First World War. And we are very lucky at the foundation that his archive of surviving images of the Middle East was, quote unquote, donated to us about 5 or 6 months ago. It is a fascinating tale of his existence, of the existence of a certain revolutionary corps. And he's a botanist at heart, right? He's a scientist, and they're trying to invent a genetic form of corn in order to save the starvation problems of the world. He sits with this sort of knowledge and goes across to the United States, but very, very soon migrates to Mexico. And on the way, what is he shooting? The people of various communities, he says. But these are people based in Syria, right? In Aleppo, largely destroyed, and Persepolis in present-day Iran. And I know the museums that we're speaking of maybe try to give us a top-down version of history, but the Gulistan Museum in Iran has been attacked in the last 2 months, and all the artifacts have been moved to an undisclosed location. And we must remember that people actually risk their lives to save those objects. So what we do with those objects, as was intimated earlier, is very, very significant and important. Just as an aside on Mr. Kankoji, he became a very, very close friend of Diego Rivera. He had a paramour by the name of Tina Modotti, one of the great revolutionary photographers of the 20th century. And there's actually, and I think I didn't point it out, but there's actually a mural dedicated to him made by Diego Rivera. That's Pandurang Sadashiv Kankoji sitting over there, sharing bread at the table. But this kind of imagery led me down, and I'm going to end very, very soon, just with some resonances, to one specific album we do have in the archive, and that is of Palestine from the late 19th century, taken by Bonfils, Felice Bonfils. The idea of a globe-trotting community is very much a phrase that is coined in the 19th century, right? And all of these individuals, including Bonfils, settles himself, and he sets up a studio called Maison Bonfils, largely shooting Syria, largely shooting Jerusalem, and what would today be considered the Green Line. But there are acres of space. Think of the shore that we see today as entirely destroyed and what this image resonates with from the 19th century. How do you breathe life back into the moment? Do these images have a trans-temporal capacity, right? What can be made to blossom in the future? And I think between the archival and the documentary, the place of political dissent becomes very, very important. And this is a mantle that gets taken on very distinctly by a group in 1978. The International Art Exhibition for Palestine was about that very notion of exiled images that need to find a place in an institution, in a place that does not have an institution, and whose community is in transit all the time. Now, it's been put together quite extraordinarily by two Arab curators, Christine Khoury and Rasha Salti. But the exhibition of 1978 must speak to us now. It was done in Beirut in 1978 at the university quarters and then was attacked, right, in 1982, where the works were largely destroyed. But what I find interesting and somewhat reassuring, because they associated with the liberation movements of Chile and Nicaragua, is that you had one Indian artist who donated to this show, Krishna Reddy, who was based in Paris at the time. So in order to create a future museum, to inscribe something for a future community of those in exile, Krishna Reddy provides one image and is the only reference point from India that you find in that show of about 200 images, 200 paintings. I also find certain individuals come to the fore in more distinct ways. Right? Faiz Ahmed Faiz, born in Sialkot, right? Studies in Lahore, teaches in Amritsar, marries in Srinagar, imprisoned in Hyderabad, lauded in Moscow, right? Spends his years in exile in Beirut. Is seen here with Arafat, and is one of the leading editors of Lotus magazine at the time, that brings together Afro-Asianism in a very, very distinct way. So for me, the idea of these images playing the role of memorials, playing the role of bringing out the spaces between erasures, right? Showing that we can actually reclaim lost geographies, territories, and even lost publics is significant. So I'm going to end. I can't take you through all these images, but this was the last exhibition that I had done in Goa, just in December. The idea in which you actually, as viewers, enter and walk into the archive of images is something I wanted to think about. But I also wanted to think about questions of migration in a different kind of way, which is beyond the image into something that is more artifactual, right? The work of Ali Arkadi that you see over here, imprinted as photo books on stone, or in fact, the work of Akram Zatari that played out a multi-channel video in which archives are shared by people who are worried that in their sharing, will they be captured? What will be told of their lives in the future? And will it be changed, pinged, and morphed to tell a story they did not want to tell? That ambivalence, I think, is something that one can retain in one's mind. And worry then about how also images are being instrumentalized. And that concern doesn't need to come with anxiety. It maybe needs to come with the question of how you endure past that moment. And so his enduring past that moment, Akram Zatari's, was to think about the shadow, about the phantom image, right? The final act of encryption is that phantom image. That idea that we become psychogeographies at the end, where the valences of territory, time, and causality make us think about what imprint we leave behind, and an imprint that might be beyond the algorithmic. So I'm going to end with this specific video. Hope it plays. I wanted to think about Trevor Paglen's work, right? There's a distinct way in which we're thinking about how the algorithmic has entered archives, histories, right? Conceptions of the image production, and henceforth. But I go back to Fairs. Fairs, who very, very distinctly says that we should embark for the last time in a direction, in a final direction, forever, without worrying about where we might return to. But I want to think of this return and the migrating image and the migrants that go with images, right? Not as those who are coming from the outside in. Migrants, and I'm quoting here, are our own returnees. They don't come from elsewhere. They come from before, and they are witnesses to us. I would like to think of us in that way, and I would like to think of archives in that way too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rahab, for that fantastic presentation. So obviously, this is against the grain, right? This is not about the absent archive, but the very present archive. And you're saying this as an archivist, obviously. Why are we not looking? Is it fear, or is it a certain comfort with amnesia? Is it a comfort with absence? Why have we not looked? This is about plenitude that where you talk from. It is everything that we have had questions about, but nothing to look at. I just want to know why you think we haven't looked enough, we haven't looked far enough, or we just bad researchers, or what is it?
No, I don't think any of the above. I mean, you've just edited a fantastic book um, on the family and the archive and its resonance today. I don't think we're not looking, certainly not. But I think there is a way in which war has created, for me, I'm talking about myself, I can't speak to anyone else, has created a fatigue, but has also pushed one in the direction of creating counters and archives, counter archives, you know. And I think that is, once you start looking for that, then this idea of displacement becomes, as I said, quite emancipatory. Right? When you start looking for questions of what lie between images, the dark spaces, the undercommons would call them the dark spaces, right? How do you look at an oil spill and not look at its tragedy, but is that a large oil painting that has been made, right? Do you start turning your description and your sort of thinking around the world on its head and inverting it for reasons that are your own? And I think we all need to have our own histories in order to do that, and our own searches and so on. But no, I think we're also being co-opted all the time, right? Our opinions are being co-opted, our thoughts are being put together and siphoned into some kind of collective sensibility, which becomes a sense of collective myopia. And maybe the idea over here is that we have to constantly put forth material again and again in symposia like this, outside symposia like this, in the public sphere, in order to create that counter, you know, that you're talking about, which is a kind of silencing, the overt silencing that is almost deafening to our ears right now, needs to have this, I don't know, needs to have a sense in which we're not thinking of archives as objects, but very much what's been said over here, as people. Each one of us is an archive. That's the point of this exercise. Each one of us has a history. And each one of us will necessarily have histories that converge, that diverge, but we complete one another, you know. As long as we can understand that that completion lies with us, then we don't rely on everything else. And I think these archives are very much born of people. So whether it's Savitri Soni, who's given us that archive, it's material we might have found in the streets, you know, it's material that we might have been directed to, such as the Disobedient Subjects album, you know, the exhibition that we have right now, Disobedient Subjects at CSMVS, is about us being pointed to that by a series of individuals to say, look at this. Now, it might have taken us 30 years. It took us 30 years between its acquisition and its exhibition, right? Those 30 years are very distinct for me because this is the time to think about disobedience, civil disobedience. And I think people have responded to that quite distinctly. So it's also the moment at which you decide to bring things out. But I understand what you're saying, but I think we collectively answer that question. And I think it's a good question for everyone else as well. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Rahab, I think over the last 2 decades, there's been this sort of utopic, or at least was framed as a utopic thing of digitization, which gave us these ideas like Creative Commons and Google Books Project and Google Museum Project, which have turned kind of insidious as archives because those were the things that were fed into this machine and data to be trained, let's Trevor Palin looking at, into perhaps this post-human, I wouldn't use this word, the two-letter acronym, but do you have any thoughts about how that is going to affect our kind of thinking of the archive?
I want you to say more as you ask that question.
The generative AI.
Generative AI. Well, I'm yet to be convinced of any good generative AI. I think I have great appreciation for good generative AI. Okay, there's some bad stuff out there which doesn't look like it's generated anything but by a machine. And I guess if machines want to be like us, then they have to do a better job. Number one. But no, I mean, we've seen all of this playing out distinctly, right? You saw it with Enola Gay, you saw it with the Pentagon images, you see it every day with what is being removed from the public sphere. You digitize everything and then you selectively redact things. Sometimes there's no human behind it. Very often there is a human behind it. There is no claim to responsibility for removing those, even though they're meant to be part of the public sphere. But I guess your question is, how do we participate, right? What is the participation of individuals within the larger scheme of things? Because eventually the erasure, I feel, will also come from us. And that generative AI is also taking signs and messages from what we are showing behaviorally and otherwise. But I think, as much as you have to think about it as objects of erasure, it's also making new images every second and creating new collaborations and new partnerships. And this is where I'd like to take something from generative AI as a positive thing. We need the idea, as I mentioned, of collaging from it. As much as it can be used to restrict us, it can be used to liberate us from the restrictions. You can turn it against itself, which is the beauty of how AI works. It will also self-contradict. It will also have hallucinations, right? And those wonderful stories in which suddenly lights come on, music starts playing, and there are all of these glitches within AI. Those glitches are hauntings, I think, telling us that at the center of it is a human that is not being able to complete the story necessarily, but is part of a story of the life of an image. And this is exactly why they have no ontology for me. You've talked about generative AI as another ontology of the image. There is no single image. I mean, I got a sense of that, and as I said, this idea of the non-ontological image is not something that I'm sharing. It's been shared by many, many individuals, including Walter Benjamin. But I think about it as quite a moment of catharsis, even for him, even for Benjamin, who we've all read, what is going to be life in the age of mechanical reproduction? It sits at the heart of modern thinking, as it were, about image practice. But then I often think about also Walter Benjamin, what he had to encounter eventually at the end of his life, right? Because of the surfeit of images that was going out during the Second World War and how he was perceived by the Allied forces, he himself could not save his own life. He ended by taking his life in Spain, unable to migrate to the West, and worrying about the fact that he would be caught by the Gestapo. I mean, it's a story of Walter Benjamin that really rings true of what you might do in order to save yourself, but survive through all the literature and the writing that you've created. And for me, his survival is really in that writing, in what it's telling us about this post-truth moment. And some of the images of Nandan Ghia I find specific there because he calls them, post-truth images, post-truth paintings. But as I said, at the end of it, there is an individual there. There is a person who's trying to think about survival as resistance. And I think we have to do that as well, especially in the age of Safit, the Safit of these images.
I think that's it then. Thank you very, very
Thank you
much.
very,
That was
very much.
absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.